things that people tend to find problematical is that they have differences and don't know how to deal well with the differences. It could be with a family member, it could be with a neighbor, it could be with your spouse, it could be with one of your kids, sibling. But if we don't learn the art of conscious combat, it can be very divisive in a relationship. It can even cost us the relationship. So there is a fine art of listening well, respectfully to the other's point of view, of not interrupting, of giving them feedback so that they understand that they have been heard with the key points that you want to communicate. Not necessarily to agree, but at least to understand. It shows tremendous respect. And it really takes some self-discipline to do this well, because everything in us may be wanting to interrupt and say, no, you didn't understand, and that's not what I said, and that's not what I meant. But being silent doesn't mean we're agreeing with what they say. It's just showing the respect and creating the context that allows for the give and take, for the going on the record, for asking for what we need, for saying what works and what doesn't work for us, in such a way that it doesn't get so inflamed. We have, all of us, sore spots from places in our childhood, from adult relationships where we've been wounded, where we've been misunderstood, where we've been betrayed, where we've been harmed. And without realizing it, people in our life sometimes go bumping into those sensitive areas. They can be really volatile and explosive. It's all information for us to understand ourselves more deeply and know what our sensitive spots are, and to finally handle them well. Doesn't necessarily mean that the conflicts that we have to be divisive. A very important researcher in our field is John Gottman, and he talks about the irreconcilable differences that couples come into a relationship with, and they study them decades later, and they have the same irreconcilable differences. It doesn't have to be a problem in the relationship. As long as the relationship has wonderfulness in more parts than it has the difficulty. And you make room for the places where you can't come to agreement, but you have understanding that's respectful.
I think that when people talk about the work that relationships require, what they're really talking about is the work not so much between us that we have to do, but it's the work on ourselves that we have to do in order to become more capable of doing the things that enable us to work through these inevitable differences, to become a better listener, to become non-reactive or non-defensive when our buttons get pushed or when we get triggered, to resist the temptation to blame the other person or to project onto them things that they're not necessarily guilty of. So the work really that it requires to be able to manage the impulses that we have that are not supporting openness and understanding in the relationship has to do with acknowledging and recognizing and accepting and taking responsibility for those aspects of ourselves that can contribute and do contribute sometimes to breakdowns in the relationship. If there was one thing that I would say is the most important thing that any couple can really learn and really bring into a relationship. It's the willingness to be responsible for contributing, which is very different than being at fault or to blame for it, but contributing, bringing something to the relationship that has caused a misunderstanding or a difficulty. You may have noticed that it's not always easy to admit to something that you may have brought that has contributed something problematic. And it's because we have a fear of being punished or blamed. Sometimes that goes back to childhood. But when we can create a mutual agreement and an understanding that we're both going to make an effort to really do what we need to do to accept our responsibility as a contributing member, part of this relationship, then we create an environment where there's enough safety for both of us to really let down our guard long enough to listen respectfully and openly to each other.
Years ago, when we had a lot of conflict in our relationship, both of us were a couple of hotheads, and we didn't have the skills. And it really was very painful. It was a situation where when we would get into clashes, I would feel like the poor me victim and that he was the bad brute persecutor. I paid attention to the process and realized that I had something to do with the outbursts that were happening. They didn't just spring forth spontaneously from nothing. It was a really important day in my life when I realized I wasn't the innocent victim and the bystander. There really isn't victims and persecutors, only co-conspirators. And when we rise up to a level of responsibility where we can see the part that we play, we're on a more level playing field. When we teach about the process that is required to practice good sportsmanship on this level playing field, we talk about personal disarmament, that all the manipulative tactics that we have ever seen and learned, that we distract, that we contradict, that we are sarcastic, that we withdraw. You know, there's many different ways, many creative ways that we can manipulate. And when we start talking straight talk and drop the manipulation out, what we find is that we're speaking at a more vulnerable level, where we're not defended. We're speaking about our pain and our fear. This requires tremendous courage on our part to speak from our more vulnerable feelings, because we're leaving ourselves undefended, and nobody can guarantee us that when we leave ourselves that open, that somebody won't come in and take advantage of that and harm us. What we can offer is that, generally speaking, vulnerability invites vulnerability back. When we disarm, the person that we are scrapping with is more apt to disarm. And when we're connected heart to heart and we're talking about our deeper feelings, that's when the understanding is more apt to take place. Now, some people don't realize when they're speaking from their feelings and when they're speaking from their thoughts. And that's an art form in and of itself. When you're speaking from your thoughts, it's likely that it's going to come out in opinions that often are critical. When you're speaking from your deeper experience and from your vulnerability, you'll be speaking from your sadness, your tenderness, your fears, and what's hurting you, and from your deepest needs. And that's a totally different kind of a conversation. So to drop down, to dive down underneath the anger to the tenderness underneath, is what unlocks those grips of the anger and those circular arguments that go round and round and round.
Yeah, Linda's really putting her finger on it with the V word. Vulnerable literally means to be at risk of being harmed. And almost everything that we do that intensifies the conflict between us or intensifies the defensiveness is some effort to avoid vulnerability. It's an attempt to keep ourselves protected from what we anticipate could be a reaction from our partner that could be emotionally painful to us. And of course, you know, like Linda said, we come into a relationship with a history that has included some degree of emotional pain. And we've come up with strategies to deal with that or to avoid it. There's a saying that the best defense is a good offense. And unfortunately, a lot of people use that in relationships and they become offensive in more ways than one. But when the focus is on protecting myself and keeping you away, I'm going to be making more of an effort to manipulate, to control, to intimidate, so that I can put some distance between you and me. And that feels safer to us. It doesn't really create more safety because that kind of offensiveness just generates the same kind of response in our partner. So the challenge has to do with being able to drop the strategies that we have practiced and used, some of us for decades, that in some ways may have served us. But when it comes to intimate relationships, only become part of the problem. So our work has to do with being responsible in ways that enable us to drop those defenses, or at least lower them long enough to hear what the other person's saying and to speak from our experience rather than making you statements which usually feel accusatory to the person that we're speaking to, making I statements which are more revealing of what we're experiencing. What we want to do when there's a difference is to reveal what we're experiencing rather than to conceal, and to connect with them rather than to protect. So focusing on how I can be more present, more available, and more open to this person, even in the face of this fear.
Now, we're both from the school of thought that opposites attract. You know that old adage? We change it just a little bit. Instead of saying opposites attract, we speak of it as complements attract. That some very deep intuitive knowing that we have, it's like sonar. And of all the thousands of people that we could have chosen to partner with, we are drawn to this particular person because they're developed in areas that we're not. They have strengths that we don't have. And that drive for mastery wants to bring that into our life so that we can learn from them to grow the areas stronger that we are not strong in yet. And then the very same things that magnetize us to this person after the infatuation wears off starts to drive us nuts. And it scares us because we think, oh no, they're so different. How can the two of us who are so different ever make it long term? But that's when it gets really interesting. If we can frame it as the differences are enlivening, not necessarily divisive. It's the differences that keep it, the dynamic tension, the polarity that keeps it very, very juicy and sparkly. But unfortunately, the difference is if they're not handled with a lot of respect, we can get overheated and we can get burnt to a crisp. That's one of the things that was problematical in our relationship before we had the skills to be able to speak our truth without the blame and the judgment in it. We were crude at first, so it didn't come out well, but we kept paying attention and coming back to our intention to understand, our intention to learn, our intention to be closer. And then when we would veer off the road and we'd start to get manipulative or weren't listening and interrupting, we'd come back to our intention again. My intention is to be closer to you. I really want to understand why it is that you see it this way. It's not how I see it. How might we blend this into something that can work for both of us? Now, this researcher that I referred to that I esteem so much, John Gottman, he talks about the three kinds of couples: the avoidant couple, the volatile couple, and the validating couple. We were once a volatile couple. Thank goodness we're not anymore. They're the ones that shout and swear and threaten and do all kinds of unskillful things. But as success goes, they're still more successful than the avoidant couple. The avoidant couple is the one that's most likely to divorce, or even worse than that, stay together, but unhappily together, but by God, they stick it out. They have a habit of sweeping issues under the rug and not dealing with it. Even the couples that are dealing unskillfully, at least the issues are on the table. But of course, the highest form of dealing with conflict is to speak and listen with tremendous respect. So if we can not just respect the differences, but celebrate the differences, you've got the making of a great relationship.